The 20th Century History Final Project, 1920 to 1929, by Sarah Turner. The most important decade in the 20th century was the 1920s because that is when the most important factors of history had happened. The rise of the KKK, Prohibition, rise of the gangsters, Dawes Plan, and the Cultural Liberation and the rise of modern society, also known as the Jazz Age, all happened during the 1920s. Without these things, we would not be where we are today. The events that happened during the 1920s define who we are as a nation and will forever be in the history of how we were created. The 1920s was the most important decade because it involved the most important events, but also because it carries the most significant value of law-changing decisions. The rise of the KKK was started and founded on December 24, 1865 by ex-Confederate soldiers, but was revived by Colonel William Joseph Simmons. Simmons revived the Klan after he saw D.W. Griffith's film Birth of a Nation, which showed the Klansmen as great heroes. Simmons made his living by selling memberships in fraternal organizations and looked to the Klan as a source of membership sales. And his first act that he officially took upon was climbing a mountain and set a cross on fire to mark the rebirth of the Klan. The main goal of the KKK was to weaken the reconstruction of the governments and to retain the power of the Southerners who were in favor of the Confederacy. Prohibition was the ratification of the 18th Amendment, but was banned as in manufacture, transportation, and any sale of intoxicating liquors. The Prohibition law was to enforce the deduction of the increased sale of illegal production and sale of liquor, otherwise known as bootlegging. It was also known to prohibit the rise of the gang violence and other crimes. The law ended up being taken away, supporting for Prohibition by the end of the 1920s. Prohibition caused several rallies and protests against it and several that supported it. Prohibition seized main violence and crime rates but also caused new ones to arise from people that were against the movement. The rise of the gangsters was where gangsters dominated various cities. Gangsters had dominance over their own cities in which they had their own elements of control. One of the well-known cities run by gangsters was Al Capone of Chicago. Capone managed to bribe both the police and the important politicians of Chicago. He spent $75 million on such ventures, but considered it a good investment of his huge fortune. His armed thugs patrolled election booths to ensure that Capone's politicians were returned to office. The city's mayor after 1927 was Big Bill Thompson, one of Capone's men. A quote from History Learning site tells us how the gangsters managed to bribe two of the highest figures in charge of Chicago, showing us the gangsters' power over the law enforcement and control. The Dawes Plan was headed by Charles G. Dawes, who was a former banker, director of the Bureau of the Budget, and the future vice president. Dawes Committee presented its proposal on April 1924, which offered a solution to problems including debt repayment and reparations. Over the 4 years of the Dawes Act, U.S. banks continued to lend Germany money to meet its payments prices to countries such as France and the United Kingdom, in which these countries used their repayment money from Germany to service their war debts to the United States. In 1925, Dawes was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for the recognition of his plans on his contribution of the resolution of the crisis of the reparations before the Dawes Plan. The cultural liberation and the rise of modern society was a main part of the 1920s, otherwise known as the Jazz Age, because people lived such different lives. People lived in cities rather than farms. People's wealth was getting doubled. Women's fashions bloomed. Women were allowed to vote. The first commercial hit radio station Airways. Many people felt uncomfortable with the new age as it had changes not only socially but politically too. It changed people's lives as they had extra money to spend. Twice as many people were voting, so political standards changed. And people were getting updates not only from papers and word of mouth, but by hearing on the radio as well, so more people got information faster. All in all, you can tell by these 5 main events that happened during the 1920s that this was an important decade as many of the main events happened during those 10 years. The few events during this time show how in just 10 years laws can change, people can change, and political standards can change as well. You learn how just one social movement can change the whole effect of one major law that was set by the government and be torn down but just the right amount of people with enough integrity and focus. The Dawes Act, I believe, is one of the biggest factors in proving this point, as it shows how it changed from not just men being able to vote, but to women and men voting, but yet the country stayed intact without any major violence or mishaps happening. And there you go for my project. I nailed it.